They sold her for $5. The Apache freed the silent girl with warrior eyes. The transaction, the dust kicked up by the wagon wheels, settled like a shroud over the ramshackle trading post that squatted on the edge of nowhere, where Texas stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The sun bore down mercilessly, turning the wooden planks of the buildings into furnaces and the dirt into fine powder that clung to everything. Clothes, skin, souls. Inside the dim interior of McCready's trading post, the air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and something else. Something that made decent folks turn away and pretend they hadn't seen. 3 men stood around a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, their voices low and businesslike, as if they were discussing the price of grain or cattle. "She don't talk, but she ain't simple," growled Jake Morrison, a scarred man whose hands bore the stains of too many dark deeds. "Knows how to work, knows how to serve." His yellowed teeth showed in what might have been a grin. The girl stood between them, small and thin, her clothes little more than rags that had once been a dress. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that might have been pretty if it hadn't been for the dirt and the hollow look in her eyes. But those eyes, they weren't empty. They burned with something that made grown men uncomfortable when they looked too long. $5, said the buyer, a fat man named Hutchins who ran a saloon 2 days' ride west. "That's generous for damaged goods." "She ain't damaged," Morrison protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just quiet. Some men like 'em quiet." The girl's hands were bound with rope, raw marks on her wrists telling the story of previous attempts at escape. She didn't flinch when they talked about her, didn't cry, didn't plead. She just stood there, staring at something none of them could see, her breathing shallow but steady. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something wilder, something that spoke of open spaces and freedom. The girl's nostrils flared slightly, and for just a moment something flickered in those dark eyes. "Deal," Hutchins said, counting out $5 silver that clinked like chains as they hit the scarred wooden counter. "But if she causes trouble, she won't," Morrison said quickly. She learned her lesson about causing trouble. The money changed hands, and with it the girl's fate was sealed once again. She'd been sold before, bought and sold like a commodity, passed from one set of cruel hands to another. Her name had been forgotten long ago, lost in the shuffle of transactions and the brutality of men who saw her as nothing more than property. But as Hutchins reached for the rope that bound her, the girl's eyes lifted for just a moment. Through the grimy window of the trading post, she could see the vast expanse of Texas spreading out like a promise. And somewhere in that vastness, she knew, lived people who understood that some things, some people, were never meant to be owned. The Apache knew these lands. They knew the value of freedom, the price of dignity, and the weight of a warrior's honor. And though she couldn't know it yet, her path was about to cross with someone who would see in her not a slave, but a storm held in silence, a storm that was about to break free. As Hutchins led her toward his wagon, the girl's feet moved automatically, but her spirit remained elsewhere, flying over the endless landscape toward something she couldn't name, but knew she would recognize when she found it. The transaction was complete, the money counted, the papers signed, but some things, she knew deep in her bones, were worth more than $5. Some things were worth everything. The hunt 3 days out from the trading post, the wagon wheels cut deep ruts through the red Texas dirt as Hutchins made his way toward his saloon. The girl sat in the back, her hands now tied to the wagon itself, her eyes never leaving the landscape that rolled past like an endless sea of grass and scattered mesquite. Hutchins was a talker, the kind of man who filled silence with his own voice because he couldn't stand the sound of his own thoughts. "You'll like working for me," he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying on the wind. "I run a clean establishment." "Well, clean enough. You do what you're told, keep your mouth shut, though I hear that ain't a problem for you, and we'll get along just fine." The girl didn't respond. She hadn't spoken in so long that sometimes she wondered if she'd forgotten how. Words were dangerous things. They could get you hurt, get you sold, get you dead. Silence was armor, and she'd worn it so long it had become part of her skin. But as the wagon rolled deeper into Apache territory, something began to stir in the air around them. The very quality of the wind seemed to change, carrying with it the sense of eyes watching, of presence just beyond the edge of sight. Hutchins felt it too, though he tried to hide his nervousness behind increasingly loud chatter. "Course, Apache ain't been trouble for years now," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Most of 'em moved on to the reservations. The ones that didn't, well, they know better than to mess with white folks just passing through." High on a ridge overlooking the wagon's path, an Apache warrior sat motionless on his horse, his weathered face a mask of concentration as he studied the travelers below. "Ayana," eternal blossom, had seen 63 summers, and his eyes held the wisdom of a man who had watched the world change around him in ways both terrible and profound. He was no longer the young warrior who had once struck fear into the hearts of settlers and soldiers alike. Age had brought him something more valuable than fear: understanding. He knew the difference between strength and brutality, between honor and cruelty, and what he saw in the wagon below stirred something deep in his chest, something that had been quiet for too long. The girl's posture told a story. Even bound, even defeated, she held herself with a kind of dignity that spoke of inner strength not yet broken. Her eyes swept the landscape with the keen awareness of a survivor, someone who had learned to read danger in the wind and safety in the shadows. Hutchins had made camp in a small hollow, where a trickle of water ran between the rocks. As night fell, he tied the girl to a mesquite tree and built his fire too large and too bright, the mark of a man who feared the darkness more than he feared giving away his position. "Don't get any ideas about running," he warned her, settling down with his bottle of whiskey. "Ain't nowhere to run to out here. Nothing but desert and Apache, and I ain't sure which is worse." The girl said nothing, but her eyes reflected the firelight like a cat's, watching, waiting, calculating. She had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable. She had learned to wait for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right chance to strike back at a world that had tried to break her. As Hutchins drank himself toward unconsciousness, the girl remained awake, her senses attuned to every sound, every shift in the wind. She felt the presence before she saw it, a shadow moving with purpose through the darkness, approaching with the silent confidence of someone who belonged to this land in ways that Hutchins never could. Ayanna moved through the night like water, his moccasined feet making no sound on the rocky ground. He had been a warrior for more than 4 decades, and stealth was as natural to him as breathing. But as he approached the camp, he found himself studying not just the tactical situation but the girl herself. Even in captivity, even bound to a tree, there was something about her that reminded him of the young Apache women he had known in his youth, a quality of inner fire that no amount of abuse could extinguish. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Her stillness wasn't defeat, it was preparation. As he settled into position above the camp, Ayanna made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Some battles were fought with weapons, others with words, but some battles were won simply by recognizing when someone deserved a chance to fight for themselves. The girl's eyes found his in the darkness, and for a moment, Hunter and Hunted shared an understanding that transcended words, cultures, and the cruel mathematics of a world that measured human worth in silver dollars. The rescue would come not because she was helpless, but because she was anything but. The silent liberation. The moon hung like a silver coin in the vast Texas sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor where Hutchins lay snoring beside the dying embers of his fire. The whiskey bottle lay empty beside him, his hand still wrapped around its neck as if it were a lifeline to consciousness. The girl had been watching the shadows for hours, her body tense against the rough bark of the mesquite tree. She had felt the presence moving through the darkness, circling their camp like a predator studying its prey. But there was something different about this hunter, something that spoke of patience and purpose rather than mere hunger. Ayanna moved like smoke through the desert night, his weathered hands steady as he approached the camp. His hair, now more silver than black, was tied back with a strip of leather, and his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much of both the beauty and the cruelty of the world. He paused at the edge of the firelight, his dark eyes meeting the girl's across the small clearing. For a moment, neither moved. Then slowly, deliberately, he pressed a finger to his lips, a gesture that transcended language and culture. The girl's eyes widened slightly, but she remained perfectly still, moving with the silence of a lifetime spent in these lands. Ayanna approached the tree where she was bound. His knife, a weapon that had seen countless battles, whispered from its sheath, its blade catching the moonlight. The girl tensed, her muscles coiling like springs, but she didn't pull away as he reached for the ropes at her wrists. The bonds fell away like dead skin, and the girl flexed her fingers, feeling the blood flow return to her hands. Ayanna's eyes never left hers as he worked, and she saw something there that she hadn't seen in any man's face for longer than she could remember: respect. He gestured toward the darkness beyond the camp, and the girl understood. Freedom lay in that darkness, but it would require trust. Trust in a stranger, trust in the unknown, trust in the possibility that not all men were monsters. As they moved away from the camp, Hutchins stirred in his sleep, mumbling something unintelligible before settling back into his whiskey-induced stupor. The girl looked back once, her jaw set with determination. She had been sold, traded, and passed from hand to hand like a piece of property, but she had never been defeated. And now, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was walking towards something rather than being dragged away from it. Ayanna led her through the night with sure steps, his knowledge of the land absolute. They climbed rocky ridges and descended into hidden valleys, following paths that were invisible to untrained eyes. The girl's feet, hardened by years of rough treatment, found purchase on the stone and sand without difficulty. She was stronger than she looked, tougher than her captors had ever imagined. As dawn approached, they reached a hidden canyon where Ayana's horse waited, a sturdy pinto with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. The warrior spoke softly to the animal in Apache, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that came from a lifetime of understanding between man and beast. He turned to the girl, his weathered face kind but serious. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, each word chosen with care. "You are free," he said simply, "but freedom is not the same as safety. The man who bought you will wake soon. He will come looking." The girl nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for lengthy explanation. She had survived this long by being smart, by thinking ahead, by never assuming that escape was the same as rescue. "You can ride?" Ayana asked. The girl hesitated, then nodded. It had been years since she'd been on a horse, but the memory was there, buried beneath layers of fear and pain. Like many things from her past, it was something she would have to remember how to trust. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Ayana helped her onto the horse. His touch was gentle, respectful, so different from the rough handling she had endured that it almost brought tears to her eyes. "We will ride to my people," he said, swinging up behind her. "You will be safe there. You will have time to heal, to remember who you are beneath all that has been done to you." The horse moved forward with smooth, easy strides, carrying them deeper into the vast landscape of Texas. Behind them, the girl could hear the distant sound of Hutchins beginning to stir, his curses echoing across the desert as he discovered his property had vanished into the dawn. But she was no longer property. She was no longer bound by ropes or chains or the cruel mathematics of men who measured human worth in silver coins. She was riding toward something she had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of a life lived on her own terms. As they rode, the girl felt something stirring in her chest, something that had been buried so deep she had feared it was dead. It was small and fragile, like a seed that had waited through a long winter for the right conditions to grow. It was hope, the awakening. The Apache village nestled in a hidden valley like a secret kept by the mountains themselves. Adobe dwellings clustered around natural springs, their walls the color of earth and sky, designed to blend seamlessly with the landscape that had sheltered the people for generations. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the scent of mesquite and roasting meat, while children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. The girl sat apart from the others, her back against a sun-warmed boulder, watching the daily rhythm of life unfold before her. It had been 3 weeks since Ayana had brought her here, and she was still learning to navigate this new world where no one owned her, where her silence was respected rather than feared. Ayana's wife, Itzayana, White Moon, had taken the girl under her wing with the gentle persistence of a woman who understood that healing came in its own time. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had seen both the beauty and the cruelty of the world, but had chosen to focus on the beauty. "You don't have to speak," Itzayana had told her on that first day, her voice soft but firm. "When you're ready, the words will come. Until then, we listen with more than our ears." The girl, who had begun to remember fragments of her original name, Elena, though she wasn't ready to claim it fully, spent her days learning the rhythms of Apache life. She helped with the cooking, her hands slowly remembering the feel of honest work done for people who appreciated it. She gathered herbs with the other women, learning to read the land for its gifts rather than its dangers. But it was the evenings that meant the most to her. Each night as the sun set behind the canyon walls, Ayana would find her by the boulder where she liked to sit. He would settle beside her, never crowding, never demanding, just sharing the silence that had become her refuge. "The desert teaches patience," he said one evening, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "It teaches that some things cannot be rushed, cannot be forced. They must be allowed to grow in their own time." Elena, for she was beginning to think of herself by that name again, nodded. She understood about patience. She had learned it in the hardest school imaginable, but she had learned it. "My grandfather used to say that silence is not the absence of words," Ayana continued. "It is the presence of understanding. You carry much understanding, I think." That night, for the first time in years, Elena slept without nightmares. She dreamed instead of wide open spaces and the sound of wind through grass, of horses running free across endless plains, of a voice that might have been her own calling out in joy rather than fear. As the days passed, she found herself drawn to the young warriors practicing their skills at the edge of the village. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years of training, their bodies and minds working in perfect harmony. But it was more than physical skill that fascinated her. It was the way they approached their training with respect, with an understanding that true strength came from discipline and honor rather than brutality. One morning, she approached Ayanna with a request that surprised them both. She still didn't speak, but her gestures were clear enough. She wanted to learn, not just to survive, but to defend herself, to stand strong in a world that had tried to break her. Ayanna studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "The path of the warrior is not about anger," he said finally. "It is not about revenge. It is about protecting what is precious, about standing between those who would harm and those who cannot protect themselves." Elena nodded, understanding flooding through her. She had seen enough violence, enough cruelty, but she had also seen what strength could look like when it was wielded with honor, when it was used to protect rather than to harm. "We will start with the basics," Ayanna said. "Not just the physical skills, but the mental ones. A warrior's greatest weapon is not the knife or the bow. It is the mind that guides them." As the weeks turned into months, Elena began to transform. Her body grew stronger, more confident. Her movements became more fluid, more purposeful, but more importantly, she began to reclaim pieces of herself that had been lost, buried beneath layers of fear and pain. She learned to read the land like a book, to move through the desert with the silent confidence of someone who belonged there. She learned to track, to hunt, to fight with both weapons and empty hands. But most importantly, she learned to trust. Not blindly, but with the careful wisdom of someone who had learned to tell the difference between strength and brutality, between honor and cruelty. And slowly, gradually, she began to remember what her voice sounded like. It started with single words spoken softly to Ayanna while they worked together in the evening light. Then short sentences, shared with Ayanna as they sat by their boulder watching the stars emerge in the desert sky. "Thank you," she said one night, her voice rusty from disuse but clear and strong, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." Ayanna smiled, his weathered face creasing with genuine warmth. "The storm was always there," he said. "We just helped clear away the clouds." But even as Elena began to heal, even as she rediscovered her strength and her voice, she knew that her past was not finished with her. Somewhere out there, men like Hutchins and Morrison were still trafficking in human misery, still treating people like property to be bought and sold. And she was beginning to understand that true healing might require her to face that darkness one more time, not as a victim, but as a warrior. The reckoning approaches. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, and his face etched with the kind of urgency that spoke of danger riding hard behind him. He was young, barely 16, with the lean build of someone who had learned to travel light and fast through hostile territory. Elena was practicing her knife work when the commotion began, her movements fluid and precise as she worked through the forms Ayanna had taught her. 6 months of training had transformed her from a broken captive into something altogether more dangerous, a woman who moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had reclaimed her power. "They're coming," the messenger gasped, accepting a cup of water from Ayanna with shaking hands. 3 men, maybe 4. They've been asking questions in every town from here to the Colorado River, offering money for information about a missing girl. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had known this day would come, had prepared for it even as she had allowed herself to hope it might never arrive. But hope, she had learned, was a luxury that women like her couldn't afford to indulge for long. Ayanna's face was grim as he listened to the messenger's report. "How far behind you are they?" "Half a day, maybe less. They've got fresh horses and they're pushing hard." The village erupted into controlled activity. This was not the first time the people had faced threats from the outside world, and they moved with the practiced efficiency of a community that had learned to protect itself. Children were gathered, weapons were checked, and defensive positions were quietly prepared. But Elena stood apart from the preparations, her mind working through possibilities and consequences. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, the unspoken question hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "You don't have to face them," Ayanna said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "You could disappear into the deep desert. We know places where no white man could follow." Elena shook her head, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt. "Running won't solve anything. They'll just keep coming, keep looking. And if not for me, then for someone else." The truth of it settled over them like a shroud. Men like Morrison and Hutchins didn't give up easily when they lost valuable property. They would keep searching, keep asking questions, keep putting pressure on anyone who might have information. And eventually that pressure would fall on the people who had given her sanctuary. "Then we fight," Ayanna said simply. "We protect what is ours to protect." "No." Elena's voice was quiet but firm. "This is my fight. I won't let you put yourselves at risk for me. You are one of us now," Ayanna replied, his weathered face set with determination. "We do not abandon our own." Elena felt something warm and fierce bloom in her chest at his words. For so long she had been alone, had faced every threat and every cruelty without allies or support. The idea that she belonged somewhere, that she was worth protecting, was still new enough to take her breath away. But with that warmth came responsibility. She couldn't hide behind other people's strength forever. She had been given a second chance, had been taught to fight, to defend herself, to stand strong in the face of adversity. Now it was time to prove that the investment had been worthwhile. "I'll meet them," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I'll meet them on my terms, not theirs." As the day wore on, Elena found herself preparing for a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the kind of person she had become during her time with the Apache. She checked her weapons, ran through her training exercises, and centered herself the way Ayana had taught her. But most importantly, she thought about why she was fighting. Not for revenge, though she would be lying if she said the desire for it wasn't there. Not for anger, though she had enough of that to fuel a dozen battles. She was fighting for the right to exist on her own terms, to be valued for more than the price some man was willing to pay for her. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Elena made her way to the boulder where she and Ayana had shared so many quiet conversations. The old warrior was waiting for her, his face calm, but his eyes alert. "You've come far," he said simply. "From the silent girl who arrived here half dead from abuse to the woman who sits beside me now. Your ancestors would be proud." Elena nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. She had come far, farther than she had ever imagined possible. But the journey wasn't over yet. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, her voice steady and sure, "I want you to know that you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What was that?" Elena smiled, and for the first time in years it was a smile without shadows. "The knowledge that I'm worth more than $5, that I'm worth more than any price someone might put on me." As darkness fell over the hidden valley, Elena prepared for a confrontation that would test everything she had learned about strength, courage, and the price of freedom. The men who had sold her like cattle were coming, expecting to find the same broken, silent girl they had traded away. Instead, they would find a warrior. The storm unleashed. The sun had barely cleared the canyon walls when the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley. Elena stood at the edge of the village, her body relaxed but ready, her hand resting lightly on the knife at her belt. Behind her, the Apache warriors had taken their positions, but this confrontation would be hers to lead. 3 men rode into the clearing, their faces hard with the kind of confidence that came from years of intimidating anyone who stood in their way. Morrison rode in the center, his scarred face twisted with satisfaction at finally tracking down his lost property. Hutchins flanked him on the left, his bulk making his horse work harder than it should have to carry him. The third man was a stranger, young, nervous, with the look of someone who had been hired for his gun rather than his brains. They pulled up short when they saw Elena standing there, and for a moment none of them spoke. The girl they remembered had been small, broken, cowed by years of abuse and degradation. The woman who faced them now stood tall and straight, her dark eyes blazing with an inner fire that made them all take an involuntary step back. "Well, well," Morrison said, his voice carrying the false cheer of a man trying to hide his uncertainty. "Look what we have here. Our little runaway has been playing dress up with the savages." Elena said nothing, but her silence had a different quality now. Where once it had been the silence of defeat, now it was the silence of a predator, choosing its moment to strike. "You've caused us a lot of trouble, girl," Hutchins added, his voice thick with anger and something else. Fear, perhaps, at the change in her. "Cost us time, money, effort, but we're reasonable men. Come along peacefully, and we'll call it even." "I have a name," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying across the clearing like the whisper of wind through grass. "Elena Vasquez. I am the daughter of Maria Vasquez, who died defending her home from men like you. I am the granddaughter of Carlos Vasquez, who fought with honor in the war for Texas independence." The men exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected development. In their world, property didn't have names, didn't have histories, didn't stand tall and speak with the voice of someone who had remembered her own worth. "That's real touching," Morrison said, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "But it don't change facts. You belong to us, bought and paid for. Now stop this nonsense and—" "I belong to no one," Elena interrupted, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I am not property to be bought and sold. I am not goods to be traded. I am a human being, with rights and dignity that no amount of money can purchase." "Pretty words," the young gunman said, nervous sweat beading on his forehead. "But words don't change the law. We got papers. Your papers are worth less than the ink they're written in," Elena replied. "They were signed by men who had no right to sign them, who treated human beings like cattle to be herded and sold." Morrison's face flushed red with anger. "Enough of this. You're coming with us one way or another. The only question is whether you walk or whether we drag you." There's a third option, Elena said, her hand moving to her knife. You turn around and ride out of here and you never traffic in human misery again. Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. You think you're some kind of warrior now? You think playing with these savages has made you dangerous? I think, Elena said, her voice deadly quiet, that you're about to find out. The violence when it came was swift and brutal. Morrison went for his gun, confident in his speed and his reputation. But Elena moved like water, like wind, like the storm that had been building inside her for years. Her knife flashed in the morning sun, and Morrison's gun fell from nerveless fingers as he stared in shock at the blood streaming from his wrist. The young gunman tried to draw, but Ayana's arrow took him in the shoulder before he could clear leather. He tumbled from his horse, crying out in pain and terror. Hutchins, seeing how quickly the situation had deteriorated, raised his hands in surrender. Now wait just a minute, he said, his voice high with panic. There's no need for violence. We can work this out, come to some kind of arrangement. The arrangement, Elena said, holding her bloody knife steady, is that you leave, now. You go back to whatever hole you crawled out of and you never come back, and you spread the word to others like you. The days of buying and selling human beings are over, at least in this part of Texas. Morrison was clutching his wounded wrist, his face pale with shock and pain. You can't just, this ain't legal. Legal? Elena's voice was filled with contempt. Was it legal when you sold me for $5? Was it legal when you treated me like an animal? Was it legal when you destroyed my family and stole my childhood? She stepped closer, her knife still ready. You want to talk about legal? Then let's talk about the law that says all men are created equal. Let's talk about the law that says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are rights that can't be taken away. The three men began backing toward their horses, finally understanding that they were facing something far more dangerous than a runaway slave. They were facing a woman who had found her strength, her voice, and her purpose. This ain't over, Morrison said, trying to salvage some dignity as he mounted his horse one-handed. We'll be back with more men with proper authority. Come back if you want, Elena said, her voice carrying across the desert like a promise. But know this, I'm not running anymore, I'm not hiding, and I'm not alone. As the three men rode away, defeated and humiliated, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. The last chains that had bound her to her past fell away, leaving her free to step into whatever future she chose to create. She had faced her demons and emerged victorious, but more importantly, she had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. The storm had been unleashed and the desert would never be the same. The new dawn 6 months had passed since the confrontation that changed everything. Elena stood on the ridge overlooking the hidden valley, watching the sun rise over the vast expanse of Texas that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The desert was painted in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and harsh and honest in ways that spoke to something deep in her soul. Below her, the Apache village was waking to another day. Children played in the dust, while their mothers prepared the morning meal. Warriors checked their weapons and discussed the day's plans. Elder council members gathered in the shade of the great cottonwood tree to share wisdom and settle disputes. It was a life of purpose and dignity, of mutual respect and shared responsibility. It was everything Elena had forgotten could exist in a world that had shown her mostly cruelty and degradation. But even as she treasured this sanctuary, she knew that her work was far from finished. Word had spread through the territory about the woman who had stood up to slave traders and sent them running. Other women had begun to seek her out, women who had escaped from similar situations, women who needed help finding their way back to themselves. The morning finds you well, Ayana said, approaching with the quiet dignity that had become so familiar to her. At 74, he moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to work with his body rather than against it. It finds me thinking, Elena replied, not taking her eyes off the horizon, about the future, about what comes next. Ayana settled beside her on the rocky outcrop, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The future is like the desert, he said. It seems empty from a distance, but when you look closely, you find it full of life. Elena smiled at his wisdom, then grew serious. There are others out there, Ayana. Women like I was, children being bought and sold like cattle, men like Morrison and Hutchins who think they can own human beings. Yes, he agreed simply. There are. I can't save them all, Elena said, her voice heavy with the weight of that knowledge. But I can save some of them. I can be the voice they don't have, the strength they haven't found yet. And you will, Ayana said with quiet confidence. But remember, you cannot give what you do not have. You cannot offer strength if you do not maintain your own. You cannot offer hope if you do not nurture it in yourself. Elena nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. She had learned, sometimes painfully, that healing was not a destination, but a journey. There would always be moments when the old fears surfaced, when the memories of her captivity threatened to overwhelm her. But she had also learned that she was stronger than those moments, that she could face them and emerge intact. "I've been thinking about leaving," she said quietly. "Not abandoning this place, but expanding, creating something bigger." Ayana's eyes showed no surprise. "Tell me." "A network," Elena said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Safe houses, people who can be trusted, routes that lead to freedom. Not just for women like me, but for anyone who needs help escaping from situations where they're being exploited." "You're talking about war," Ayana said, though his tone held approval rather than censure. "I'm talking about justice," Elena corrected. "I'm talking about making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. I'm talking about creating a world where human dignity is valued more than silver dollars." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the desert come alive with the day's activities. Finally, Ayana spoke again. "You know that this path will be dangerous. The men you're opposing have power, money, influence. They won't give up easily." "I know," Elena said. "But I also know that I'm not the same person they sold for $5. I'm not the silent girl who was too broken to fight back. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I remember who I am." "Then you will need allies," Ayana said. "People who understand that some fights are worth the cost." Elena turned to look at him, seeing the resolve in his weathered features. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that the Apache have always understood the value of freedom," he said. "We've fought for it, died for it, lived for it, and we recognize it in others who share that understanding." Over the following weeks, Elena's vision began to take shape. She started with small steps, helping a Mexican woman who had escaped from a brothel in El Paso, providing temporary shelter for a family of former slaves making their way north. Each success built on the last, creating a network of trust and mutual aid that stretched across the territory. The work was dangerous. There were close calls, narrow escapes, moments when violence seemed inevitable. But Elena had learned to navigate danger with the same patience and cunning that had kept her alive during her years of captivity. She moved through the shadows of society, appearing where she was needed and vanishing before her enemies could track her down. The network grows. By the end of her second year in the Hidden Valley, Elena had established safe houses in 4 different towns and built relationships with sympathetic allies throughout the region. She had also gained a reputation that made men like Morrison and Hutchins nervous. They called her La Sombra, the shadow, for her ability to appear and disappear at will. But success came with a price. The more visible her network became, the more attention it attracted from those who profited from human misery. Bounty hunters began asking questions. Local authorities, many of whom were in the pockets of slave traders, started cracking down on anyone suspected of helping runaways. The crisis came when Elena received word that a group of children, some as young as 8, were being held in a compound outside of San Antonio, destined for sale to the highest bidders. The intelligence came from Maria Santos, a former captive who had become one of Elena's most trusted allies. 12 children, Maria reported, her voice tight with controlled anger. 4 guards, maybe 5. They're keeping them in an old ranch house, planning to move them north in 3 days. Elena studied the crude map Maria had drawn, her mind already working through the tactical challenges. The compound was isolated, which was good for avoiding witnesses but bad for escape routes. The guards would be experienced, probably armed with rifles as well as handguns. "We'll need help," Elena said finally. "This isn't something we can handle alone." "I was hoping you'd say that." Ayana's voice came from behind them. He stood in the doorway of Elena's small adobe house, his expression serious but determined. "Because I may have a solution. The rescue." The attack came at dawn, when the guards were changing shifts and their attention was divided. Elena led a team of 6, herself, Maria, 2 other women from her network, and 2 young Apache warriors who had volunteered for the mission. They moved through the morning mist like ghosts, their approach covered by the natural sounds of the desert waking up. The ranch house sat in a natural depression, surrounded by scrub brush and rocky outcroppings that provided perfect cover for their approach. Elena had spent 2 days studying the guards' routines, noting their patterns and weaknesses. She knew when they made their rounds, when they ate, when they relaxed their vigilance. The first guard never saw her coming. Elena's knife took him silently, efficiently, without cruelty but without hesitation. This was war now, and she fought it with the same moral clarity that had sustained her through her own captivity. The second guard fell to one of the Apache warriors, an arrow through his heart before he could cry out. The third managed to get off a single shot before Maria's bullet found its mark. Inside the ranch house, Elena found what she had expected and dreaded. 12 children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 15, huddled together in a back room. Their eyes held the same hollow look she remembered from her own reflection during her darkest days. "It's all right," she said softly, kneeling down to their level. "I'm here to take you home." The oldest of the children, a girl of perhaps 14, stared at her with suspicious eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered. "My name is Elena," she said, "and I know what it's like to be where you are now. But I also know that it doesn't have to end this way. The price of freedom." The rescue was successful, but it came at a cost Elena hadn't anticipated. Word of the raid spread quickly through the criminal networks that trafficked in human misery. Within days, wanted posters bearing Elena's likeness appeared in towns throughout the territory. The bounty on her head was substantial enough to attract serious attention from professional hunters. More troubling was the response from local authorities. The ranch house had belonged to a man with political connections, and its destruction had embarrassed powerful people who preferred to keep their involvement in such enterprises hidden. Pressure was being applied to find and prosecute those responsible. "They're calling you a terrorist," Maria reported during one of their clandestine meetings, saying you're leading an armed rebellion against lawful authority. Elena almost laughed at the irony. "Lawful authority," she repeated. "Is that what they called it when they sold me for $5? But she understood the implications. The network she had built was now under serious threat. Safe houses were being watched, allies were being questioned, and the entire operation was in danger of being rolled up by hostile forces. "We need to think about disbanding," Maria said reluctantly, "going underground, waiting for things to cool down." "No," Elena said firmly. "That's exactly what they want. They want us to be afraid, to give up, to let them go back to business as usual. Then what do you suggest?" Elena stared out at the desert, thinking of all the people who were counting on her network for their freedom, their safety, their very lives. She thought of the children they had rescued, now safely placed with families who would love and protect them. She thought of the women who had found their voices again, who had reclaimed their dignity and their strength. "We expand," she said finally. "We take this fight to them instead of waiting for them to come to us." Epilogue. The legend lives years later. When historians tried to piece together the story of the Underground Railroad's western branch, they would find Elena's name woven through dozens of accounts. Former slaves spoke of a woman who appeared out of nowhere to guide them to safety. Rescued children grew up to tell stories of the lady who taught them they were worth more than any price someone might put on them. The Apache elders would remember her as the silent girl who found her voice and used it to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. They would tell how she learned that true strength came not from the ability to endure suffering, but from the courage to ensure that others didn't have to. Elena Vasquez became a legend in her own time, though she would have laughed at the title. She was simply a woman who had learned the difference between surviving and living, between being broken and being whole. She was someone who had discovered that the most radical act in a world that treated people as property was to insist on their fundamental human dignity. The network she built outlasted her by decades, evolving and adapting to meet new challenges and threats. It became a model for other liberation movements, proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. And in the hidden valley where it all began, the Apache elders would tell young people the story of Elena Vasquez, the woman who was sold for $5 and who spent the rest of her life proving that every human being was worth infinitely more than any price someone might put on them. "The desert remembers everything," they would say. And what it remembered about Elena was not her silence, but her voice, not her captivity, but her freedom, not her price, but her worth. The storm had indeed been unleashed, and the world was better for it.